Today we're looking at Woke is Dead by Piers Morgan. I've no idea if that's true. I sort of hope so. That being said, I'm not massively clear on what wokery really is, or where the boundaries are in terms of how you define it. As I understand it, originally it was seen as a good thing, being aware to social injustice, that sort of thing. But it does seem that it has clearly become a little bit more than that, and it goes off into a little bit of silliness. I get the impression that these days, people who are woke won't generally refer to themselves as woke, because it's become a little bit of a derogatory term that the rest of us use to refer to something that's just a little bit annoying and silly. But I mean, given some of the ideology that comes along with it, as far as I understand it, that would seem a sort of a reasonable strategy by them not to associate with it. I picked this book up anyway, just because I wasn't aware that it had gone, or it was going and on the way out. But then I do live in this sort of neatly curated little bubble where I don't really run into it, other than I have a teenager running around here somewhere who has some interesting ideas. And I also have to admit, I don't know much about Piers Morgan. As far as I'm aware, he's sort of tied up with news, and I'm not generally a big fan of the news. Certainly not to the extent that it's become a bit of a hobby for some people, hasn't it? And that cannot be a good thing. But that's not to say I don't think journalism is important, and perhaps to some extent a lot of this silliness that crept in has gone away again, if that's true, because of the likes of people like that, promoting sensibleness and common sense, that sort of thing. That being said, unfortunately, he starts the book talking about Donald Trump, who is a pal of his apparently. And I picked this book up just after Donald had started bombing Iran. But he does refer to Donald Trump as straight talking, which I sort of get there's an angle to that in terms of we'll say what needs to be said regardless of whether it is well received, that sort of thing. But there's an element to straight talkingness that has to at least be true. And yeah, I'm not entirely convinced that's Donald's strong point. He does a quick run through, Piers this is, not Donald Trump, of some of the more extreme bits of wokery. You know, the idea that you end up with men in women's prisons identifying as women and then causing all sorts of problems, and teachers in schools promoting a woke agenda. And I'm always a bit cautious on when someone's talking about something at the extremes. I mean, on anything, you go to an extreme and it does get silly. So I'm not sure that's necessarily quite representative of day-to-day experience of wokeness. But as I understand it, that stuff was really happening. And he does seem to boil it down to the idea that actually it all comes down to cowardice. And that's really interesting. And this incident with Keir Starmer springs to mind. And I believe originally he was asked, what is a woman? And he had some trouble answering this question. And then later on, the High Court ruled on it, or something, that a woman is, surprise, surprise, a biological adult female. And suddenly his position was clarified. That would seem to slam dunk, therefore, that he wasn't prepared to say what he presumably really thought originally until a court was there to back him up, presumably on the assumption that there was going to be some sort of backlash. And I'm sure there would have been as well, no doubt. So, yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. And I'm sure it's not all cowardice. I think that's perhaps to some extent, that's some of the virtue of Gen Z and Gen Alpha. It does seem to come to a significant extent from a caring for other people and wanting to see things being done fairly and all the rest of it. But yeah, there's clearly some cowardice in there as well, certainly at corporate and governance level. He gives one definition of wokeism as being the opposite of common sense, which is sort of interesting because I guess common sense is not that common, perhaps. And again, at the extremes, it will tend to break down, I think. It's you apply a common sense, then shove it in a really extreme situation. It doesn't quite work. But that is a disingenuous way of arguing, I think. 95% of everything is not at the extremes. So, yeah. He talks about the phrase man up as being one of the most offensive things you can say to a wokey, as he calls them. I think that's kind of funny, to be fair. I mean, there's no denying that there's some sort of crisis of masculinity going on. Even I see that from my little bubble. And men being a little bit useless. And I do think the woke agenda does seem to twist masculinity, the whole toxic masculinity thing. But masculinity being basically about providing, protecting and serving. There's nothing toxic in that. I mean, people were doing it wrong, obviously. Some people. But by and large, I think it's difficult to argue that a lot of men's problems could be actually solved by just manning up a little bit, and it does seem kind of reasonable. He links as well, actually, to The Anxious Generation, the book I did a review on for the author. I can't say his name, Jonathan Haidt or something like that. And that talks about dopamine and all the rest of it, and social media and all that causing problem for people. So they get to this point of crippling anxiety where they just can't cope with the real world. And yeah, I think there seems to be a lot to be said for that. And the idea that the world is just going a little bit soft, and people argue that they can't do things because it's hard. And, you know, it's a reasonable expectation that grown-ups, generally speaking, obviously ignoring the extremes, should be able to do hard things. It's not an unreasonable thing to expect them to be able to do it. He talks as well about the period between 2015 and 2025 being a period you could call the wokies, like the noughties or the 20s or 90s, whatever, the wokies, and links that period with the rise of body positivity, as it were, which is an odd thing. I recall a Facebook post I saw, it was quite a while, it must have been, probably was 10 years ago, someone talking about it's not okay to discriminate on the grounds of gender or race or anything like that, but people seem to think it's okay to fat shame, as it were, basically trying to put weight in that same category as race and gender and that sort of thing. And it doesn't quite fit, does it? Because, I mean, in nearly all cases, someone's weight is basically a choice. I get that there are people at the extremes who have real trouble, and perhaps medically even it's not possible for them to be thin. I don't know if that's even true, but by and large, you'd think most people who are overweight would rather not be. And the thing stopping them is that it's hard. And body positivity seemed to be this thing about saying, no, it's okay to not do that hard thing and just stick with what you want, or stick with what you are and just not try. But there's a lot wrong with that, I think. And I mean, don't get me wrong, if you want to be large and you're willing to take the risk with all the health and lifestyle problems that come with that, yeah, fine. You know, that's your choice. It's absolutely fine. But I don't know, I think it's unlikely that most people who are overweight want to be. And I guess this would tie into the whole rise of Ozempic and all that lot. So suddenly there's a sort of a cheat code to losing the weight, and people are taking it in droves, which would seem to back that up. So that would seem overall to suggest that the body positivity thing is a bit of a scam, and it's just some way of patting people on the head and saying, there, I know it's hard, you don't have to, we'll just pretend that it's not a problem, and you can try and reconcile in your head that you're not what you'd like to be, and you could be if you tried. But this is not going to be a very popular video at all, is it? But never mind. Another interesting idea, he talks about it being a uniting religion for atheists. And that's really interesting, because on my other YouTube channel, reading the Bible and trying to work out if it's true, that sort of thing, and if it makes much sense. I've been doing that for a couple of years now. And my daughter and I simultaneously have been sort of exploring religion. She's going to church, that sort of thing. And it's really interesting that you can't take wokery and put it into a Christian context. It doesn't fit, because that forces you to accept that there's something more important. It's not just about you. The secular world just doesn't have any sort of solid foundation to put in there. And I guess that's the problem with wokery, isn't it? It does boil down to, this is how I feel about this, and I'm just going to shove this into the world, into people's faces. And I love that that's not compatible with a religion system where what's actually at the bottom of it is that it's not about you. But then, of course, it does make sense that if you are an atheist, a sort of a woke ideology does give you a sort of religion. And that's kind of a deep and profound point. I quite like that one. He goes on to talk about virtue signalling, which is one of my pet hates, and uses the example of BMW at Pride 2024, apparently, changed the colour of their badges for some event to the rainbow, basically, for LGBTQ. Except they didn't do it in a lot of the Middle East countries, and they cited the reason for this being, you know, culture and legislative thing, so we can't really do it. And Piers Morgan brings that back to say, okay, so what you're saying is that you'll fight for gay rights, but only for people who don't need you to do it. And then obviously just links that to the fact that, you know, it is just virtue signalling, and big brands don't actually care about any of that stuff. And yeah, well, that's why it's one of my pet hates, is that pretending you care about something you don't. And you think, at the very least, don't pretend to have a virtue on something. If you're not prepared to die on that hill, which is probably not an appropriate thing to do for a company, you probably shouldn't be doing that, but don't pretend that you are. It's yeah, quite like that. He goes to talk about the origins of the expression black sheep of the family, which apparently has become problematic in some circles. And he talks about, it actually goes back to proper shepherding, where if you had a black sheep, you couldn't dye the wool, so you were limited in what you could do with it. Therefore, it was worth less than the other one. And then this has become problematic, apparently, because it's seen as being sort of racially motivated. But it's obviously got absolutely nothing to do with that. And in that, you then get the problem that people are creating sort of a racial issue where there isn't one. And it's, I guess, the alternative to that, the whole colourblind idea is we're just people. I've sort of jumped the gun on this one a little bit, but here he identifies it all boils down to a me-centric view of the world. I love that. That was a point I made at a parenting thing I went to last year. And I made one of the closing points of the day was that one of the problems it was talk about the Gen Z and Gen Alpha and how all this anxiety and all the rest of it, and they're just trying to find meaning and all the rest of it. And my point was they need something to sort of substitute for themselves, because if you have a view of the world that's very me-centric, it's all about how you feel about things. And none of that really works. It just doesn't stack up. It's not a good foundation for an actual life. So you need something to pull out and put in. That was actually a church-related meeting. So in that context, obviously the implication was that you replace it with a selfless religion. He talks about, referring to the green cause, he talks about they're not actually trying to save the world. They're just looking for meaning. And that's the same idea, isn't it? You take out something so you care about this great cause for the whole world, and you put that in, and then you push that agenda. But I mean, it sort of works, I suppose, in that respect, because you are not necessarily being me-centric in the sense that you are championing a cause, but it is still, I don't think this is quite right, and then I'm going to militantly shove this in your face. So, yeah, interesting. He then goes into sharing some of his philosophy on life, which, whether or not you disagree with people, when someone is supremely successful, as he clearly is, it's always brilliant if they're willing to share that sort of stuff, I think. So really quite interesting stuff. And the first thing he talks about was negative patterns. And he goes into a big old long, it's quite boring, quite a long list of good things that happened on Friday the 13th historically, just to make the point that just because it's perceived as being a terrible thing, you can frame it a different way. And then links that up with the idea that it's very difficult to be successful if you're negative about things. And there was a correlation between people thinking positively and success. And I do like that. It's, you do have to be careful how you take things on board, because it's very easy to just present something as, oh, Friday the 13th, and here's a list of terrible things that happened. And you could conclude that it's just awful and it's dangerous and you should just stay in bed on Friday the 13th. And then, of course, there's all this evidence to the contrary as well. So, yeah, that positive mindset thing I think is really important in life. He also talks about luck, and the better you do, the more positive you are, the harder you work, the luckier you tend to get, which is something I've talked about many times before. It's an issue dear to my heart. He makes the point that his views are not fixed, which I think is really important. And it's he will change his mind where things come along. It's a difficult thing to do if you're a politician, I suppose, but for the rest of us. And he takes on other evidence and angles, and he contrasts that with wokery, characterising it as being very fixed and rigid. I don't quite know if that's true, because I don't really know any wokies, really. My 11-year-old's version of it it's a bit unsophisticated because she's 11. To be fair, I'm encouraging her to expand and develop on that. But yeah, no, it would seem it would sort of fit. He makes the point also that being sad doesn't make you mentally ill. Actually, that's something I covered in the book review I did for Maximum Achievement on here. And Brian Tracy back in the 90s saying that there's no such thing as, or basically no such thing as mental illness. It's just varying degrees of irresponsibility. And that's maybe going a bit far with it. I mean, at the minute, and you get those people walking around with blokes walking around t-shirts saying boys get sad too. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's a mental illness thing, but I don't feel like that's particularly helpful necessarily. He boils down one of his things is just get on with it when he's talking about procrastination, that sort of thing. I had a boss in one of the nightclubs I ran 30 years ago or something nearly, and he was, you say, JFDI, which was the Nike slogan with a bit of emphasis. And it's so perfect for a lot of situations, you know, oh, I don't know about where to start with this, and you just JFDI, just get off your bum, start doing stuff. And I really like that. And actually, my daughter finds that quite helpful as well, actually, when she's getting stuck and fear of failure. That's we just JFDI, on you go, just get it done, or just get started. And then finally, he has an alternative interpretation of FOMO, and being the fear of missing out. I talked about this in one of the Morgan Housel reviews, actually, and he was saying that the training yourself out of acting on FOMO, in financial situations at least, is probably one of the most important skills any of us can learn. Piers Morgan reframes it as focus on myself only. Yeah, so, yeah, it's probably quite a good way of looking at that. Having a bit of a revival of the 4 quotes, or 3 quotes, I don't know, it's 4 for this one. I haven't had any for a few, but the first one we have: how can you be sure that you are right if you never heard a competing opinion on why you may be wrong? A good example of this, actually, when after Charlie Kirk was killed, suddenly ended up with lots of things in the feed of Charlie Kirk debating. And I looked into it a bit because my daughter had been given the idea that he was a racist homophobe or something like that, and then couldn't find any evidence for it. She'd just been told that by the 11-year-old woke agenda sort of thing. And I mean, it could just be selective quotes, the things that are popping up on my feed or whatever. But it seems a lot of people come down to yell at him about what he's doing wrong and then don't listen. And it does seem to very much slam dunk that there's a lot of, I've got this idea, I'm just going to shove it in your face, I'm not actually going to listen or debate. Next we have, be polite and respectful but severely allergic to bullshit. Follow gut instinct instead of the herd, and never be afraid to say what you mean. You do need some care around saying what you mean, don't you? Because, I mean, you've got to be a bit diplomatic about it sometimes. I mean, it does seem that Piers Morgan is quite happy just to say things and be a little bit obnoxious, I think. I don't know that for sure, but you could get that impression. And, you know, still in there, you need to be respectful. You know? So there's a right and a wrong way to do that sort of thing, isn't there? Next, we have success is about overcoming failure, not avoiding it. I really like that. That's another thing I have with my daughter. She has a bit of trouble getting started sometimes because she's worried about not doing very well. And it's like, don't just get on with it. Otherwise, you're guaranteed to have failed because you haven't even tried. So again, a Brian Tracy thing from Maximum Achievement, when he talks about the average number of times people try before they fail is less than 1. You know, so on average, a lot of people just won't even get started in the first place. And last but not least, this is on the subject of procrastination. The road to glory is winding, arduous and long, so you should be massively impatient about setting off as quickly as possible. Which I guess is, yeah, the JFDI thing again, isn't it? So, but yeah, I mean, it's light-hearted, pretty easygoing, kind of funny. I hope he's right. I don't know if he is, but yeah, well, worth a read.